At 10:02 a.m. inside the United States Supreme Court, a short written order began circulating among reporters seated in the press section. There was no dramatic announcement, no extended reading from the bench. Instead, a single legal development quietly signaled the end of one of the most aggressive trade policies in recent years. The court had rejected the legal foundation used to impose sweeping global tariffs, ruling that the authority claimed by the executive branch exceeded what federal law allowed. Within minutes, attorneys, economists, and government officials began parsing the language, recognizing that the decision did not merely pause a policy. It removed the legal mechanism that made it possible in the first place. The dispute centered on whether emergency economic powers could be used to justify tariffs applied broadly to international imports. The administration had argued that long-standing trade imbalances and supply chain vulnerabilities constituted a national emergency, allowing the president to act without waiting for Congress. Challengers, including business groups and several states, argued that tariffs are fundamentally a form of taxation and regulation of commerce, powers that the Constitution assigns to the legislative branch. The court agreed with that interpretation, concluding that the statute being used did not clearly authorize tariffs and could not be stretched to cover measures with such vast economic consequences. In practical terms, the ruling means that the tariff structure developed under that emergency justification can no longer stand under that legal theory. The justices emphasized that when an executive action carries major national impact, the authority to take that action must be unmistakably granted by Congress. Without that clarity, the separation of powers requires the courts to intervene. The decision reflects a continuing judicial pattern of closely examining claims of expansive executive authority, particularly when those claims attempt to reshape entire sectors of the economy. Inside financial and trade circles, the reaction was immediate but measured. Companies that had spent years adjusting sourcing strategies, pricing models, and logistics networks to account for tariff costs suddenly faced a different calculation. Importers began consulting counsel about reimbursement mechanisms, while exporters assessed how trading partners might respond now that the duties were legally invalidated. Government agencies responsible for collecting those tariffs also confronted operational questions about unwinding a system that had generated significant revenue while it was in effect. The decision does not eliminate the government's ability to impose tariffs altogether. Instead, it clarifies that such measures must proceed through statutory channels explicitly authorized by Congress, using trade laws designed for that purpose rather than emergency declarations. That distinction is central to understanding the court's reasoning. The ruling addresses process, not policy preference. It does not declare tariffs improper as an economic tool. It declares that their use must follow the constitutional framework that allocates authority between branches of government. By midday, legal analysts described the outcome as a structural ruling rather than a political one. The court did not weigh whether tariffs helped or harmed the economy. It answered a narrower but more enduring question: who gets to decide? As the implications of the ruling moved beyond the courtroom, attention shifted to how the tariff program had been constructed and why it became vulnerable to legal challenge. The policy had relied on a statute originally designed to address sudden external threats, such as financial sanctions against hostile actors or the freezing of foreign assets during crises. Over time, that law had been interpreted broadly by multiple administrations, but it had rarely been used to justify trade-wide duties affecting nearly every major economic partner. That expansion became the central legal fault line. During oral arguments, several justices questioned whether economic competition or trade deficits could meet the threshold of an unusual and extraordinary threat, language embedded in the statute itself. The challengers argued that if such conditions were enough to invoke emergency powers, then virtually any economic disagreement could justify unilateral executive action. The court ultimately agreed that allowing tariffs under that interpretation would effectively transfer Congress's constitutional authority over commerce into the hands of the executive branch without clear legislative approval. The majority opinion stressed that tariffs historically occupy a unique legal category. Unlike sanctions, which target specific actors or behaviors, tariffs reshape pricing structures across entire markets. That scale of impact, the court reasoned, demands explicit authorization because it directly influences taxation, trade flows, and domestic industry protection. By requiring Congress to act when such sweeping measures are contemplated, the judiciary reaffirmed a principle embedded since the nation's founding. Large economic rules must emerge from the branch accountable for writing laws, not enforcing them. In business communities, the ruling triggered a complex reassessment rather than immediate celebration. Many firms had already invested heavily to adapt to the tariff environment, relocating supply chains or negotiating long-term contracts under the assumption that duties would remain. Those adjustments cannot be reversed overnight. Executives began evaluating whether reverting to earlier sourcing models would actually reduce costs or introduce new uncertainty. Trade policy, once altered, leaves operational footprints that persist even after legal change. Government lawyers also face technical challenges. Agencies responsible for customs enforcement must now determine how to handle entries assessed under the invalidated tariff regime. Questions about refunds, recalculations, and administrative procedures will likely unfold over months, not days. Courts may see additional litigation addressing how financial consequences should be reconciled when a nationwide policy is struck down after implementation. Meanwhile, international observers interpreted the decision as evidence of institutional checks functioning as designed. Trading partners that had criticized the tariffs as unilateral actions now watched the American legal system recalibrate authority internally. Diplomats and trade officials began signaling cautious interest in renewed negotiations, though they remain aware that future tariff proposals could still arise through legislative channels. The ruling therefore marks neither the end of trade disputes nor a definitive shift toward free trade. Instead, it redefines the pathway through which such disputes must be addressed. Economic confrontation, if pursued, must now move through Congress, where debate, amendment, and coalition building shape outcomes. That procedural requirement alone may alter the speed and character of future trade actions, making them more deliberate and less sudden. By late afternoon, legal scholars describe the moment as a reaffirmation of constitutional architecture rather than a commentary on globalization. The court had not settled arguments about trade strategy. It had clarified that the rules governing how strategy becomes policy remain firmly rooted in the separation of powers. In the hours following the decision, market behavior provided one of the clearest indicators of how seriously the ruling was being taken across the economic landscape. Investors responded not simply to the removal of specific tariffs, but to the restoration of predictability in how trade policy would be formed going forward. For global markets, certainty about process often matters as much as the substance of policy itself. When companies can anticipate that major economic measures must pass through legislative debate, they gain a clearer timeline for planning investment, hiring, and production. Trade analysts noted that the invalidated tariffs had functioned as both a financial cost and a strategic signal. They were intended to pressure trading partners while also encouraging domestic manufacturing adjustments. With the legal foundation removed, businesses now face a recalibration period. Some sectors that benefited from protectionist pricing may encounter renewed competition, while industries reliant on imported components could see cost relief. These shifts rarely occur evenly. Instead, they unfold gradually as contracts expire, inventories adjust, and new agreements replace those negotiated under the prior framework. Within federal agencies, the ruling has triggered internal reviews of how emergency economic authorities are interpreted. Legal advisors are expected to scrutinize other executive actions to ensure they rest on statutory language that clearly authorizes their scope. This type of institutional reassessment is common after a major judicial decision, particularly one emphasizing limits on delegated power. Agencies must now ensure that future policy initiatives are designed with stronger legislative grounding to withstand judicial scrutiny. Members of Congress, meanwhile, find themselves drawn back into the center of trade policymaking. Lawmakers who had previously criticized or supported the tariffs from the sidelines must now decide whether to pursue new legislation if similar measures are desired. That process introduces hearings, committee negotiations, and potential compromises reflecting a wider array of regional and economic interests. Unlike executive action, which can be implemented rapidly, legislative solutions require consensus building that may slow dramatic policy swings. Internationally, the decision has been interpreted as a signal that U.S. trade relationships will continue to be shaped through institutional processes rather than unilateral declarations. Allies and competitors alike monitor not only the outcome, but also the method by which it was reached. A judicial reaffirmation of congressional authority suggests that future economic disputes may involve more negotiation and less abrupt imposition of duties. though disagreements themselves are unlikely to disappear. Legal commentators emphasize that the court's reasoning fits into a broader pattern of decisions requiring clearer authorization when federal agencies, or the executive branch, attempt actions with sweeping national consequences. This approach reinforces the idea that transformative economic measures must originate in statutes written with precision rather than inferred from general emergency language. The doctrine guiding that reasoning has increasingly influenced administrative law, affecting areas far beyond trade. By the close of the day, the conversation had shifted from whether the tariffs would survive to how governance structures adapt after their removal. Businesses prepared compliance updates. Government departments began procedural adjustments. Lawmakers considered next steps. The judiciary, having issued its interpretation, stepped back from the policy arena it had briefly entered. What remained was not a vacuum, but a reassertion of roles, each branch returning to the functions assigned to it under constitutional design. The final stage of this development now moves away from judicial language and into the slower mechanics of implementation, where legal conclusions translate into administrative reality. Federal agencies must unwind procedures that governed how tariffs were assessed, collected, and recorded. That includes updating customs guidance, revising enforcement directives, and coordinating with importers whose transactions were structured under the previous rules. Such transitions are rarely immediate. They involve regulatory notices, recalculated obligations, and in some cases, further litigation over how financial adjustments should be handled. For companies operating across borders, the change introduces both relief and uncertainty. While the removal of tariffs may lower certain costs, firms must again revise forecasts, renegotiate supplier terms, and evaluate whether earlier restructuring decisions still make sense. Supply chains that shifted to avoid duties may not instantly revert, particularly if alternative sourcing has already proven efficient. Trade policy leaves lasting commercial footprints, and businesses often move cautiously before reversing course. Economists observing the situation describe the decision as restoring procedural predictability rather than dictating a particular economic philosophy. The court did not rule on whether tariffs are effective tools. It ruled that they must emerge from a process clearly anchored in legislative authority. That distinction ensures that future debates over protection, competition, or globalization will take place in Congress, where competing interests are weighed publicly and statutory language defines the limits of action. Lawmakers now face the responsibility the decision effectively returns to them. If there is political will to impose comparable trade measures, new legislation would be required, crafted with specificity sufficient to survive judicial review. That pathway demands negotiation across committees, testimony from affected industries, and alignment among elected representatives whose constituencies experience trade impacts differently. Such deliberation can slow policymaking, but it also distributes accountability more broadly. International partners are watching this transition carefully. The invalidation of tariffs imposed through emergency authority may ease immediate tensions. Yet it also underscores that U.S. trade policy remains subject to domestic institutional balance. Negotiators must consider not only executive priorities, but also congressional dynamics and the legal boundaries courts have reinforced. In that sense, the ruling becomes part of the diplomatic landscape as much as the economic one. From a constitutional perspective, the case illustrates how structural principles continue to shape modern governance, even in highly technical areas like global commerce. Separation of powers is often discussed abstractly, but decisions such as this demonstrate its practical consequences. When authority is redistributed back to its designated branch, policy outcomes may change not because courts favor one approach, but because the process itself alters what can be enacted. As agencies implement the decision, businesses adapt, and lawmakers consider their next moves, the immediate drama gives way to routine governmental function. The tariffs at issue no longer rest on the legal ground that created them. What follows will depend on legislation, negotiation, and administrative adjustment rather than emergency declaration. The ruling closes one chapter of trade policy while reopening the institutional pathways through which future economic decisions must travel.